The 26th Amendment. How America's youth won the vote in just 100 days. Imagine being drafted to fight in a war, but having no say in electing the leaders who sent you there. That was the reality for millions of young Americans in 1970 at the height of the Vietnam War. 4 students lay dead on a college campus, shot by National Guardsmen. The nation was tearing itself apart. And in the middle of this chaos, Congress and the states did something unprecedented. They passed and ratified a constitutional amendment in about 100 days, the fastest ratification in American history. This is the story of the 26th Amendment. The story actually begins decades earlier, in the middle of World War II. On November 13, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt signed into law a bill that would change the lives of millions of young men. For the first time, 18-year-olds could now be drafted into military service. With that signature, a phrase was born that would echo through American politics for the next 3 decades. Old enough to fight, old enough to vote. It would take nearly 29 years for that slogan to become reality. On January 7, 1954, President Dwight Eisenhower stood before Congress and delivered his State of the Union address. In it, he made a bold statement. For years, our citizens between the ages of 18 and 21 have, in time of peril, been summoned to fight for America. They should participate in the political process that produces this fateful summons. I urge Congress to propose to the states a constitutional amendment permitting citizens to vote when they reach the age of 18. Eisenhower became the first president to publicly support lowering the voting age to 18. Congress didn't act. The proposal went nowhere. Young Americans would have to wait. By 1970, the Vietnam War was raging, and so were American college campuses. 18-year-old men were being drafted, shipped overseas, and sent into combat. Yet in most of America, these young men couldn't vote. They had no voice in choosing the leaders who could send them to die. The controversial nature of the Vietnam War made this contradiction impossible to ignore. The tension was building. Then it exploded. May 4, 1970, Kent State University in Ohio. Just 4 days earlier, President Nixon had announced that U.S. forces would invade Cambodia, expanding the Vietnam War. Students gathered on campus to protest. Then, the unthinkable happened. 28 National Guardsmen opened fire on the crowd of demonstrators. They fired between 61 and 67 rounds over approximately 13 seconds. When the shooting stopped, 4 students were dead and 9 were wounded. The 4 victims killed were Allison Krauss, 19 years old, Jeffrey Miller, 20, Sandra Lee Scheuer, 20, and William Schroeder, 19. Photographer John Philo captured an iconic image that came to define the anti-war movement. 14-year-old Mary Vecchio screaming over Jeffrey Miller's body. Philo won a Pulitzer Prize, and the scene was shown by the nation's newspapers, the broadcast networks, and around the world in a time before the internet. The Kent State shooting sent shockwaves across the nation. Student strikes erupted on hundreds of campuses. The tragedy at Kent State galvanized the movement for the 18-year-old vote, creating an undeniable and tragic link between the war in Vietnam and the young people being asked to fight it. For a growing number of Americans, the conclusion was becoming inescapable. If young people were old enough to die for their country, they were certainly old enough to have their voices heard at the ballot box. Now, to understand why it took a constitutional amendment to lower the voting age, an understanding of how the Constitution worked is necessary. The founders left voting qualifications entirely up to the states. Article 1, Section 2 says that the electors in each state shall have the qualifications requisite for electors of the most numerous branch of the state legislature. In plain English, this meant states decided who could vote for their state legislatures, and those same people could vote in federal elections. Few states had voting ages lower than 21 before 1971. When Alaska entered the Union in 1959, its minimum voting age was 19. Hawaii, also joining in 1959, chose 20. Georgia and Kentucky had lowered theirs to 18. By 1971, 9 states total had voting ages of 18, 19, or 20. but most states still required voters to be 21. Every time America had expanded voting rights nationally, a constitutional amendment was required. The 15th Amendment protected freed slaves' right to vote. The 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. The 23rd Amendment let Washington, D.C. residents vote for president. The 24th Amendment prohibited poll taxes. The law was clear. National voting standards required amending the Constitution. Despite the law and history, in 1970, Congress tried to lower the voting age through regular legislation rather than through a constitutional amendment. In 1965, Congress had passed the Voting Rights Act to combat racial discrimination in voting. The act was set to expire after 5 years. In 1970, when Congress renewed the Voting Rights Act, a provision lowering the minimum voting age to 18 for all elections, federal, state, and local, was added. On July 22, 1970, President Richard Nixon signed it into law, though the president had his doubts. At the signing ceremony, Nixon expressed concern that lowering the voting age without a constitutional amendment might not be legal, and directed his Attorney General, John Mitchell, to expedite an appeal to the Supreme Court. The case reached the Supreme Court with remarkable speed, light speed by Supreme Court standards. On December 21, 1970, less than 6 months after Nixon signed the law, the court issued its decision in Oregon v. Mitchell, and Nixon had been right. The court ruled that Congress did not have the power to set a national voting age for all elections without a constitutional amendment. The decision was split in a strange way. The court said Congress could lower the age for federal elections, but not for state and local elections. The message was clear. If you want to lower the voting age nationally for all elections, you need a constitutional amendment. Enter Senator Jennings Randolph of West Virginia, who had first introduced legislation in 1942 to lower the voting age. By 1970, he had made such proposals 11 times. Senator Randolph would become known as the father of the 26th Amendment. After the Supreme Court's Oregon v. Mitchell decision, Randolph introduced the 26th Amendment resolution in the Senate in January 1971. In the House, Speaker Carl Albert of Oklahoma endorsed it. Congress moved with stunning speed. On March 10, 1971, the Senate voted. The result? A unanimous 94-0. 13 days later, on March 23, 1971, the House of Representatives voted. The margin was overwhelming, 401-19. In one of the most politically turbulent periods in American history, with the nation deeply divided over Vietnam, civil rights, and generational conflict, Congress came together with extraordinary bipartisan support. Republicans and Democrats agreed. Young people who could be drafted to fight deserved a voice in choosing their leaders. The proposed amendment read, Section 1. The right of citizens of the United States who are 18 years of age or older to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of age. Section 2 provided Congress power to pass laws to enforce Section 1. Now the proposal went to the states. What happened next was unprecedented. The states responded with lightning speed as state legislatures ratified the amendment. On July 1, 1971, the 38th state ratified the proposal. The exact identity of that 38th state has been disputed. Ohio's House of Representatives cast what was generally considered the decisive vote on the evening of June 30th, though North Carolina and Alabama also ratified around the same time. 3/4 of the states had approved it. The 26th Amendment was now part of the Constitution. From proposal to ratification took about 100 days and shattered all records. The 26th Amendment became the fastest ratification in American constitutional history. On July 5, 1971, President Nixon held a ceremony at the White House. 500 newly eligible young voters attended. Nixon ceremonially signed the amendment. An important legal note: under Article 5 of the Constitution, the President has no legal role in the amendment process. A presidential signature is not required for an amendment to become part of the Constitution. Ratification is complete when 3/4 of state legislatures approve it. Nixon's signature was purely ceremonial, a symbolic gesture to honor the occasion. At the ceremony, Nixon declared, "The reason I believe that your generation, the 11 million new voters, will do so much for America at home is that you will infuse into this nation some idealism, some courage, some stamina, some high moral purpose that this country always needs. So after all that struggle, after the deaths at Kent State, after the protests and the political battles and the fastest constitutional amendment in history, did young people actually vote? The first presidential election after ratification was 1972. Youth turnout hit 55% among 18 to 29-year-olds. That was the highest turnout rate ever recorded for young voters. 11 million new voters were eligible. About half of them went to the polls. It was a moment of triumph, but also a question mark. Senator Jennings Randolph, who had fought for nearly 3 decades to lower the voting age, believed in young people's potential to improve the American Republic. The first election suggested he might be right. Would it last? Would young voters continue to show up? Would they actually change elections? That's a story that would unfold over the next 50 years, a story of ups and downs, of disappointments and surprising victories. It's a story explored in the next video. The 26th Amendment stands as proof that constitutional change is possible, even in turbulent times. It took 29 years from the first draft of 18-year-olds during World War II to ratification. It took tragedy and protest and political courage. It happened, and in just 100 days, once Congress finally acted, the fastest constitutional amendment in American history. Like this video and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching. Help combat constitutional illiteracy.